This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 677 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Thursday nights officially belong to the NFL again, and FanDuel and Amazon Prime Video have teamed up to bring you more ways to win this NFL season. Introducing the Prime Video Pick'em, a free-to-play pick'em contest centered around one of the most exciting events of the week, Thursday Night Football. Here's how it works. You'll be given 10 questions to answer about Thursday night's game. Fans who answer the most questions correctly will win a share of $15,000 in cash prizes. It's that easy. Be sure to tune into Amazon Prime Video's Thursday Night Football Week 3 matchup to keep track of your score. No purchase necessary, age and location restrictions apply, void where prohibited. See full terms at FanDuel.com. It's a 15 transactions day. Let's do this. Buy Leonard Fournette. So the Buccaneers haven't really been themselves over the first 2 weeks of the season. Tom Brady's thrown 61 pass attempts. Last year through 2 weeks, he was at 86. And Tampa Bay right now is bottom 10 in yards per play. But here's my simple question. Are we going to really bet against Tom Brady? The Buccaneers have now faced two good defenses in Dallas and New Orleans. There was no air it out game script. And they've also had some wide receiver injuries too. And ejections. Mike Evans is now suspended for week 3. Leonard Fournette, in turn, has been totally average in terms of production. He scored 15.7 and 9.4 PPR points in his 2 games. But he's seeing a lot of work. He's one of 8 running backs pre-Monday Night Football who's seen at least 80% of his team's running back rushes. He's at 84%. And of that group, he's one of 6 to have a 10% plus target share this season. We know the ceiling is there for Leonard Fournette if and when this offense gets going. I don't know if they're going to be as good as they were in 2021 or even 2020, but they will be better offensively. They won't be a bottom 10 unit. So that means more fantasy points for Leonard Fournette, who is still a bell cow in that offense. Sell or hold Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So CEH has looked pretty good this season. He had a couple of short receiving touchdowns in week 1 that gave him a top 6 running back finish. And then this past week, the running back position just wasn't very good, so he had another top 10 finish. And I'll be honest with you, you just heard me say to sell Clyde Edwards-Helaire. There's a very real chance that a lot of fantasy managers just don't believe in him, because he's burned them so many times in the past. So admittedly, this transaction is a little bit iffy. I just wanted to point out that there are some red flags with his usage. I talked about this a little bit last week, but in their week 1 blowout win, Edwards-Helaire only handled 30% of the team's running back rushes. He had a 7.7% target share. Now that definitely had to do with the blowout. That definitely had to do with game script. But it's still noteworthy because it could happen again. And the next time it happens, we can't bank on 2 receiving touchdowns. Now in week 2 against the Chargers, that running back rush share did rise, but it was still just 53.3%. His target share was solid. It was 11.8%. But that's not exactly RB1 type usage. But that's how he's scoring. He's scoring like an RB1. And then the other thing is, after 2 games, Jerick McKinnon and Isaiah Pacheco each have a goal line rush. Clyde Edwards-Helaire does not, and that's a continuation from last year's usage. CEH had just 3 goal line attempts in 10 games last year. And then lastly, when looking at Pro Football Focus's expected fantasy points formula, which tells us how many points we'd expect a player to score with the type of volume that he's seeing, Clyde Edwards-Helaire has exceeded that expectation by roughly 18 PPR points so far. So regression is on its way. But again, I will say this sell recommendation is making the assumption that you actually can sell high. I don't know if that's really the case, but I would love to sell CEH for a high-end wide receiver. Or maybe pair him with another player to really upgrade the running back position, to really get a bell cow back. But if you can't do that, I might just hold CEH. Because the offense is good. He's likely going to play above expectation because of the Chiefs' offense. I just don't think he's going to play this far above expectation. Hold Sky Moore. So speaking of the Chiefs' offense, Sky Moore has not done a whole lot to start his NFL career. He's played 15 snaps over his first 2 games. But I wanted to shout him out this week because there were people talking about him on the Late Round Fantasy Football Discord, asking if they should drop him. I think it's still time to be patient. Now, it's understandable if you're in a shallow league and you need to drop Sky Moore. You can't just wait around. But there are a few things to keep in mind. First, this Kansas City offense is one of the best in the league. So situationally, we know that he's in a good spot. Second, look at the Kansas City wide receivers. What have they done to start the year? I do think that Juju Smith-Schuster is sort of a buy candidate right now, but it's not like this group has been awesome. They didn't look very good in week 2 at all. And then the most important piece, the third thing, is that prospects like Sky Moore, they tend to produce much better during the second half of their rookie seasons. We would love for them to get off to a hot start. But non-elite, non-first round rookie wide receivers tend to see huge spikes in fantasy scoring during the second half of their rookie seasons. I laid this all out in episode 647 on rookie wide receivers in redraft leagues. So if I can do it, I'm keeping Sky Moore rostered. And I'm just watching over the next week or two to see if that snap rate does indeed increase. Add Garrett Wilson. So Garrett Wilson looks like a stud. My prospect model liked him. He was a 97th percentile prospect in that model. Anything above the 95th percentile is a very good sign. And so far, so good. He now leads the Jets with a 22% target share, and he saw 14 targets in week 2. Now, he did play fewer snaps than both Elijah Moore and Corey Davis, so he's technically playing behind those guys. But because of game script for New York, he ran just as many routes as Corey Davis did in week 2. Now, I'm still a believer in Elijah Moore, the talent. And Wilson will need to leapfrog Corey Davis to be easier to start each week. But we can't sit here and say that that's unlikely to happen. Garrett Wilson is clearly a very talented wide receiver. And you want talent on your fantasy roster. Maybe his high target share won't maintain with a switch at quarterback, but you should be adding Garrett Wilson this week, absolutely. I think he's the number 1 waiver wire add. Buy Chris Olave. So speaking of studs, Chris Olave might be a stud too. My prospect model gave him a 98th percentile rating. Again, anything over the 95th percentile is considered very, very good. He hasn't produced like Garrett Wilson so far, but Olave's peripherals in week 2 were out of this world. He had a disappointing 9.4% target share in week 1, but in week 2, that rose to 32.5%. He had 13 targets. He ended up seeing over 300 air yards. According to Michael Florio of NFL Fantasy, Olave had the 3rd highest air yards total in the next-gen stats era this past week, in his 2nd career game. He and Jameis Winston just couldn't connect, so he had a 5-catch, 80-yard day, which is still a good day. But better days are definitely ahead for Chris Olave. Hold Travis Etienne. So through 2 games, James Robinson has out-attempted Etienne 34-13, and Etienne has seen 7 targets to Robinson's 4. Now this may seem really, really bad for Etienne, and it's not great for him. But there are a couple of pieces of good news. First, when you look at Pro Football Focus's expected fantasy points formula, James Robinson has been expected to score about 30 PPR points so far this year. He's exceeded that by about 6 points. Meanwhile, Etienne, he's at about 21 expected points. He's been below that. So technically, this gap that we see between James Robinson and Travis Etienne, it's probably not as significant as it seems. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the Jags have played in 2 game scripts that have favored James Robinson. Part of the Travis Etienne allure, aside from the fact that James Robinson was hurt, which seems to not matter at all because he's amazing, but part of the allure is that Jacksonville will be trailing in games this year. And thus far, that really hasn't been the case. But they get the Chargers and the Eagles over their next 2. That could really benefit Etienne's snap share. But yeah, I think this James Robinson emergence, if you will, I mean, he's always been a really good player, but the fact that he's gotten over this injury, I think it means that we're unlikely going to see Travis Etienne as an RB1 in fantasy football in PPR formats. But he can still be a valuable RB2. So trading him away right now does not seem logical. Add Raheem Mostert. So last week I talked about Chase Edmonds being a buy candidate based on his week 1 usage. And if it maintained, he would be probably a mid-range RB2 this year. And then week 2 happened, and it didn't maintain. Out of nowhere, the Dolphins decided to use Raheem Mostert a lot more against the Ravens. Mostert played 41.7% of the team's snaps in week 1. That was almost 55% in week 2. He saw 27.8% of the team's running back rushes in week 1. That was 64.7% in week 2. Edmonds' week 1 usage was seriously amazing, but not this week 2 usage. Mostert ran just one fewer route than Chase Edmonds in that shootout win over the Ravens. The difference in week 1 in routes run was 8. So if this is a true split like we saw in week 2, then that's big for Raheem Mostert and it's not great for Chase Edmonds. Right now, Mostert's rostered in 43% of Yahoo leagues, so he could be out there in your league. Sell Antonio Gibson. So the week 115 transactions podcast, I talked about holding Antonio Gibson, despite the fact that I didn't like him that much entering the season this year. But this is what I wrote about him. I said, so there's less of a chance that McKissick is heavily involved in those contests. I may not feel confident in his season-long outlook, but Gibson may come out looking fine after 2 weeks of football. And that was purely just based on the schedule. Washington opened up their season against Jacksonville and Detroit. And Gibson came through. Before Monday Night Football, Gibson's sitting at RB11 in PPR points scored at running back. Now, I'm not saying all this to just pat myself on the back. I'm just pointing out that this plan has come to fruition. Selling Gibson before the season started wouldn't have made that much sense because of their schedule. But now you can do it, especially after what we saw last week. Week 2 was not very good for Antonio Gibson. He scored 12.1 PPR points. That's great. He found the end zone. But his target share dipped below that 10% mark, with J.D. McKissick seeing more work in a negative game script. In week 1, Gibson ran more routes according to Pro Football Focus than McKissick did. But that flipped in week 2 with McKissick running more. And Gibson's snap share fell by almost 10% from week 1 to week 2. This is the problem that you can run into with game script dependent running backs. Without that touchdown this past week, Antonio Gibson would not have been that great. That's just not something that I like to deal with week in and week out. We have a larger sample size now of Gibson not seeing that many looks through the air with J.D. McKissick active. And there's another reason that you might want to sell Gibson too. Add Brian Robinson. This is the reason. As we know, the Commanders spent a day 2 pick on Brian Robinson this offseason. He has a 3-down skill set, and he looked great in the preseason. But as we all know, he was unfortunately shot in an armed robbery before the season. But thankfully, all reports on his recovery have been very positive. He actually got back to practice last week. We don't really know where this is headed. But since he's rostered in fewer than half of Yahoo leagues, I don't think he's a bad speculative add this week. This week isn't that great for the waiver wire anyway. Add Ashton Dulin. One of the lower key question marks entering the season for fantasy purposes was who's going to be the number 2 option in Indianapolis. We know they have Michael Pittman, but who's going to be the guy that emerges opposite of him? Would it be Alec Pierce? Maybe Paris Campbell? Now, we still don't have our answer, but it might be Ashton Dulin. Dulin's a small school wide receiver who had insane production. I remember when he was coming out, I actually talked about him on this show. But because he's coming from this small school, he came from Malone University. Because he's coming from this small school, it wouldn't be that surprising for him to take some time to get acclimated to the NFL. So the fact that he's a 4th-year wide receiver, I don't think that's a sign that he can't produce. And he's been productive this year. He already has 125 receiving yards, and he has a 16.7% target share in this Colts offense. And that's while playing just 45% of the team's offensive snaps. He's been targeted at a top 10 rate per route run this year. Michael Pittman's banged up. Alec Pierce is dealing with a concussion. There's potential for Dulin in week 3. But even when everyone's healthy, we should be open to the idea that Ashton Dulin could work his way to being the Colts' number 2 wide receiver. Sell DJ Moore. Yeah, I'm a little bit panicked about DJ Moore. I think he's a great football player. He's one of the better wide receivers in the league. And it's always tough to sit here on this show and talk about a very good player being a sell candidate, because it can really bite me in the butt. I just don't know if Baker Mayfield is going to be able to elevate Moore in fantasy football. Through 2 games, Robbie Anderson has out-targeted Moore 13-11. He leads this team in expected points at wide receiver. The Panthers are bottom 10 in the league in yards per play, and Baker Mayfield ranks outside the top 30 in quarterback grade over on Pro Football Focus. Maybe this is me just overreacting to 2 games. And maybe the Panthers get rid of Matt Rule sooner rather than later, which could help the offense, because I think Matt Rule is not very good. I'm just not convinced this offense is going to take a step forward. And with the early season target shares looking the way they look, it may be the right time to move on from Moore because of his week 2 output. Add Sterling Shepard. One of the things that I just generally got wrong this year was overstating injuries. These guys are coming back from Achilles much faster than I expected. And good for them. I'm happy for them. I just ended up getting that wrong. After 2 weeks, Sterling Shepard coming off this Achilles tear at 29 years old, he's crushing it. He leads all Giants receivers in snap share. We have to react to this because Sterling Shepard's a really good football player. Kenny Golladay is now completely irrelevant in this New York offense. He played 2 snaps this past week. Kadarius Toney hasn't completely won over this staff yet. So it's Sterling Shepard. He has a 26.4% target share this season. We've seen Shepard be productive in the past, and it seems like this Achilles injury is completely behind him. So I think he's a very good add this week. Drop Cole Kmet. This is another thing that I did not get right this year, or at least it looks that way. I thought Cole Kmet would at least be able to give you some sort of floor. But he's giving you literally nothing. Like quite literally nothing. After 2 games, Justin Fields has fewer pass attempts than Dak Prescott. Yes, Dak Prescott, the guy who got hurt in week 1. Chicago wide receivers have totaled just 7 receptions. That's the same number of catches that Cooper Kupp had during an 8-minute span on Sunday against the Falcons. Cole Kmet cannot be rostered. He's only seen 2 targets and he didn't catch either one of them. His route participation is fine, but this is not a passing attack that you want to rely on for fantasy purposes. Chances are Cole Kmet won't be anything more than a streamer this year. And even if he does emerge, it's probably going to take some time for people to catch up to that anyway. Because the trust just won't be there immediately. So I think that you can safely drop him. Add Evan Ingram. So far this season, Evan Ingram is top 10 in routes run, top 12 in fantasy points, and top 15 in expected fantasy points. He's playing on a team that will likely trail a good bit this year, despite what week 2 showed us. He's a 17.6% target share. He's a worthwhile add for anyone who needs a tight end, aka anyone who has Cole Kmet. Add the New York Giants defense. So you could go in a couple of different directions this week with your streaming defense, but I'm going to shout out the Giants. Maybe you want to use the Seahawks against the Falcons, that's fine. But I'm going to go to the Giants this week because they're playing at home. They're 2.5-point favorites. FanDuel Sportsbook has this game with a low 39.5-point over-under, and they're facing Cooper Rush. So I think that the Giants are the right kind of process play. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Remember to go to lateround.com where you can find the link to the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. It's been a really active community, and I've been producing weekly rankings, rest of season rankings. We have live stream Q&As, and much more. Definitely check it out, lateround.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.